this really incredible book. The point is to change the world. And I'm going to speak fairly swiftly for about 20 minutes. And I want to end with a clip of Andai. I want to thank Honor for sitting on Andai and encouraging her over and over again over the last decade or more to work on this book. She never just listened to the niece. So it really took Honor's persuasion to help get us over the finish line. And I want to thank Honor and Robin for generously agreeing to write two really moving and powerful forwards. I want to just begin by contextualizing Andai a bit for those of you who would have encountered her for the first time. Growing up in what would become a middle-class household, both of her parents were nurses and her father would study and eventually become a doctor. Andai studied at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica before returning to Guyana in 1965, where she joined a radical political pressure group called Movement Against Oppression, which would lead to her losing her government job as an acting principal of a secondary school in Georgetown. As a result, in the early 1970s, she moved to New York and went to CUNY in the SEEK program for education elevation through knowledge, and was involved in various liberation struggles, from Black Power to anti-apartheid to various struggles in Central and Latin America. In 1978, she was persuaded by one of the co-leaders of the Working People's Alliance, Rupert Roopnaraine, who had returned to Guyana at Walter Rodney's persuasion to make a film which became The Terror and the Time and ended up staying, but he came back to New York and persuaded Andai to return to Guyana to join the multiracial movement at the height of the anti-dictatorial struggle, the Working People's Alliance, which became a political party in 1979. It was actually formed in 1974, fully 4 years before Walter Rodney would return to Guyana. She became its international secretary, its women's secretary, its political affairs coordinator, and she was also the editor of Day Clean, which was the party newspaper. Day Clean is Guyanese vernacular for sunrise, the day is clean. And she was also editor of some of Walter's last writings, including History of the Guyanese Working People. She's often said, you know, the history of the Guyanese working people went to the typesetter with 3 fingers, 2 of Walter's and 1 of mine, which was published posthumously after his assassination on June 13th, 1980. The 1980s would mark a turning point for the Anglophone Caribbean. While opposition to authoritarianism and military dictatorships was growing in Latin America, we experienced the imposition of structural adjustment policies. And you have an excellent and very detailed reading by Rhoda, who you'll be meeting next week in your list of readings for this course. We witnessed the end of democratic socialism in Jamaica and suffered the implosion of the Grenadian Revolution and the US invasion that followed. During this time, Andai's activism decisively shifted to organizing with women. The disintegration of the women's arm of the People's Revolutionary Government following the collapse in Grenada shaped the decision of several of the WPA women to establish Red Thread in 1986. And those are the co-founders, is Karen D'Souza, top left, my left, followed by Andai, the Radzik sisters, Danuta at the top, Vanda at the bottom, Jocelyn Dow, Benita Bowen Harris, and Diane Matthews. And Red Thread was actually an autonomous organization whose mandate is to organize with women across racial divides, beginning with the lives of grassroots women whose caring work is seen as the foundation of society and who understand their liberation in relation to wider strategies of transformation. This decision would ultimately lead to a wholesale exodus of the women from the party. Regionally, Andai became an executive member of the Caribbean Association for Feminist Research and Action. That's something Rhoda can speak to more fulsomely than I can actually, which challenged the devastating impact of neoliberalism on poor women and families. And she also served as a resource person for Caribbean government's preparations for the 1995 World Conference on Women held in Beijing. Again, Rhoda can speak to this. So Rhoda, you won't crash my class. You get homework when this is done, if any questions come on this. So internationally, Andai was actively involved in Wages for Housework, which became the Global Women's Strike. And she had in fact met Margaret Prescott, who is there with the slightly brownish dreadlocks at the end next to Karen D'Souza. She'd met Margaret Prescott and Wilmette Brown, who were founders of Black Women for Wages for Housework in New York when she was living there in the 1970s. But it was not until 1982 that she would meet Selma James and get introduced to Wages for Housework when she went to the UK on a trip as the international secretary for the WPA and ended up occupying a church with, I think it was the English Collective of Prostitutes. Salma is actually pushing 86, 85 or 86, and has a new book that's about to come out. And we're, in the midst of discussing a possible book launch sometime this summer or fall. So she's still active and still quite incredible. And I was involved in a number of global strike international campaigns, from opposing the removal of Haitian President Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who Anna tells me is ill, very ill in Cuba right now with COVID, by the governments of Canada, the US, and France on the 200th anniversary of Haitian independence, to offering regional support for the successful effort to recognize the significance of unwaged work in the Bolivarian Constitution of Venezuela. She did most of this while battling cancer and the aftermaths of its treatment. First diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in 1989 and then breast cancer in 2012, she co-founded the Guyana Cancer Society and the Cancer Survivors Action Group, and was very involved in getting cancer patients, raising funding to get cancer patients treated in Trinidad with her colleague and compadre Hazel Brown from Trinidad and Tobago. And Aya's journey, I think, movingly exemplifies what Audre Lorde, who was her friend, once wrote in the Cancer Journals, quote, "There must be some way to integrate death into living, neither ignoring it nor giving into it," end quote. For me, and I also offers an inspiring answer to Guyanese poet Martin Carter's observation that life is a question, asking what is the way to die. In his introduction to a Small Axe special issue on the idea of a Black radical tradition, edited by Nigel Cunningham, David Scott speaks about the importance of keeping, quote, "the very argument about a Black radical tradition in perpetual motion," end quote. Not as faithful affirmation, in other words, but what I might refer to as a loving disloyalty that comes from a place of integrity, captured by Cunningham's image of a broken bridge. For me, this refuses a way of thinking about tradition that is either static or that makes lists, because it raises the question of who's knowing or whose lists become authoritative. It also refuses a way of thinking about tradition that engages in uncritical rehearsal, and I detested pedestalization or hagiographic accounts, or top-down warped notions of leadership. This was, I think, linked to her clear-eyed denunciation of doctor, doctoress, big man, big woman, big person politics. As she once said to me, "There's no point in my having made so many mistakes in my life if you or others can't benefit from them." And Aya's anthology, The Point Is to Change the World, was posthumously published last year, and it's actually being translated right now into Portuguese for a Brazilian audience by Edición Funilario. Consisting of talks, letters to the newspaper, diary entries, newspaper columns, and speeches, it captures just a fraction of her work. And Anthony Bogues and I are actually now working on a cache of letters that we've discovered from George Lamming to Andaye, which he's just given us permission to edit and publish. For example, she had a newspaper column called Women's Eye View that ran from 1997 to 2000. There's a lot that she wrote with others, with the exception of two pieces from the 1980s. The selection in this collection is from the 1990s and 2000s. It took us close to 10 years, partly due to interruptions for serious illness, partly due to a fire which destroyed a section of her house and almost all of her written work, partly due to the challenges of working across two countries and all the other things I had to attend to whenever I actually came home to visit my mother. But it was not just that. In essay 27, speaking of Walter Rodney, Andaye says that academics, quote, "academics may choose to place Rodney's writings in categories. Activists who want to see whether and how they may be of use today should not," end quote. I think this pretty much sums up Andaye's own approach to what she was doing. As she noted in her preface, she hoped it can contribute to people who are organizing for change. To be of use to organizers then, this was her primary audience. And that tension between the institutional demands of publication and the dynamic, effervescent ground of social action is captured in this typically impatient exchange. Actually, this isn't typical at all. This is one of the more polite of our interactions. As Anna knows, she could be quite rough. And I've just been reading a really wonderful article called "Between Left and Right, I Remain Black" by the Black Brazilian feminist Sueli Carneiro, who speaks similarly of her own alienation from the academic environment. And she comes up with this term that she draws from Boaventura de Souza, epistemicide, to speak about the absence of any sort of discussion, or the elision of any sort of discussion of Black radical thinking from Brazilian universities, and that all of that was actually being generated from civil society organizations. Very different take on civil society from what I think we have in the Anglophone Caribbean, and about which Andaye was pretty cynical. This tension then was not technical or stylistic. It was driven by Andaya's political commitment and intent for the volume. In the interview with Badura Lagra that you read for this course, Sylvia Winter, speaking of Black studies, describes language as, quote, the way that we will carry ourselves out of these problems we have, quote, and as fundamental to, quote, the transformation of the whole society and an entirely new knowledge order altogether, end quote. I think we see this in Andaya's description of what they were after in the 1970s. And here she's explaining the significance of the poet Martin Carter to an entire generation of radical anti-colonial and anti-neocolonial activists in Guyana. She actually ends that quote by saying, who else was there for that, for all of this that we were doing, but Martin? The newspaper, it was really one sheet. It was a one sheet because of the restrictions and the bannings at the time. It was a one sheet that was printed off on a Gestetner machine, day clean. As she said, each newsletter started with a poem or quote, which told the week's story, sometimes showing how our struggle was part of a global struggle. Each of these would often have cartoons that were done by the artist Osase, who died last year. The artwork, as in this cover, would be done by the late Brian Rodway. This was an issue that was produced following the gunning down of the activist Ohene Koam. I don't think this is actually Day Clean. I think this is one of the WPA publications. And I has also noted that, quote, the experience of the left in the English-speaking Caribbean shows that the interpretation of the world, which begins and usually ends with the so-called point of production, is really about a belief in the management and control of people, and not about the revolutionizing of human relations, including the relations of production, end quote. This revolutionizing of human relations was really central to how she saw her work in the world, and it's also a term that George Lamming has used on several occasions. But it seems to me that languaging the world anew, if we go back to Sylvia Winter, can actually really only work in communities of actual and radical practice. And one of Andaya's favorite phrases was that language is the product and producer of action. You will actually find it several times in this collection, which I have understood to reflect the work of knowledge in motion, in that active engagement in the process of change. It's captured in her description of Walter Rodney, that he was fighting while he wrote and writing while he fought. And in another interview, I think with Ed Ferguson, she says, quote, one time Walter was sitting in a vehicle and he was writing on his knee. Another time he was asked in a sheepish tone, you sleeping? And he answered, no, I want to work for another couple of hours. But in this regard, Andaya was very much the same, always turning things over in that head of hers, twirling her hair, she did that constantly, you can see it in this picture, and finding things to scribble on various bits of paper or on the back of envelopes. This was whether she was on the streets or in more recent years, and as a result of illness, confined more or less to her home. She was writing while she fought cancer and all of the other long-term and debilitating conditions generated by chemotherapy, which she speaks about in essay 15 and in a longer version in the last issue of Scholar and Feminist Online, which we published shortly after her death. And this actually became her office for the last 10 years. This was in April, a month before she would go into hospital for the final time. Her bed was her desk. At this point, she's unable to sit properly, so she kneels on the ground and leans over the pillow to work. The book took so damn long then, because the selection, the order, the seemingly endless editing were all driven not just by what Andaya wanted to say, but by who she hoped to reach. She edited right down to the last day that she could speak. And in fact, there were two bits of the book that I'm not going to get into, that she was not actually satisfied with and that she wanted to keep working on, that she did not quite get to. Since her death, I've come to see this fastidiousness as trying to come to the best understanding one could of a given situation or given moment, or seeing it from as many sides as one could. And in your foreword, Robin, I think you described this perfectly as 360-degree vision, as I think the term that you used. Even if Andaya recognized this trait in herself with some frustration and described it as at times immobilizing. So it's coming to that understanding and trying to communicate or language that, not for its own sake, but precisely because one is invested and involved in a politics of transformation. This is what in my editor's note I named as a politics of precision. So in my time remaining, let me just very quickly highlight 5 points from the readings before we open up to a conversation about what you took from them or questions you have that perhaps we can work through together, because I'm not necessarily here to just answer the questions. I probably don't have all the answers, but maybe we can struggle with them together. First point is that the point is to actually change the world. In other words, the title of the book is in fact Andaye's premise and raison d'etre. You have to challenge capitalism by organizing against all the work they make us do, she would say, which involves unifying, quote, the struggles of all sectors against capital, ensuring that we begin with those with the least power and resources in the capitalist hierarchy, the unwaged worker, so that all are included, end quote. By organizing, she meant radically expanding the space of politics. There's an interview she gives about, it's about maybe 9 or 10 years ago, but it's relevant even more perhaps today in the context of our Caribbean, in which she speaks about how politics has become over-centralized, monopolized by political parties in the contest, the endless contest for state power, crowding out space for politics at the local or community levels, by which we don't mean parochial or cut off from the transnational, crowding out space for the kinds of organizational dynamism and richness that offer multiple avenues for working out what it is people want and acting together to actually achieve that. What we see here then is an emphasis on starting from the self-organized activity of working people, their significance as historical agents, their capacity to theorize and to story their connected worlds, captured in a slogan from the days of the WPA, people's power and dictatorship. This image is actually taken from Walter Rodney's funeral. It is a vision that rejects leader politics, rejects one-manism or one-womanism, and it is a vision that emphasizes that self-emancipation is fundamentally a collective project. And let me give you an example. I was sent some audio recordings of Andaye speaking, and I actually have not really been able to face listening to them until a few nights ago. They were sent to me by the Global Strike. A few nights ago, when I downloaded one meeting where she spoke at during a US speaking tour she did with Salma James about 10 to 11 years ago. It was at the No Bookstore in Durham, North Carolina, which at the time was a long-standing Black bookstore and community space, kind of like Third World Books, which was run by the Johnsons on Bathurst Street, Toronto, when I was an undergraduate at York University in the 80s, or what has sort of become the newest incarnation of that, a different book list in the People's Residence, now run by Barbadian Aita Sadu and Trinidadian Miguel San Vicente, further up on Bathurst Street, north of Bloor. When actually introduced at this talk, Andaye refuses the title of guest speaker and says, "My name is Andaye and I'm not the guest speaker, we will all speak," and then actually proceeded to demonstrate this in action. It turned out that Andaye had found out that evening that the bookstore was being evicted, and sadly it later was. And on the spot, she turned the entire meeting around by first asking Bruce Bridges to open the meeting. He had run it as a bookstore, a community space, a jazz hall, a diner and restaurant. And so she turned it around by asking him to start by explaining what was going on to the gathering, who had come to hear her. Then when it was her turn to speak, she spent like 10 minutes on Guyana, and the rest of her talk, she begins by asking people to speak first. She wants to hear from them. Why did you come to the bookstore? How did you know about the bookstore? What did you get out of the bookstore? And then once they answered that, she was like, well, what will you now do to save all of this that you have just described? And went into a brainstorming session. Did they know any other buildings? Did they know any other spaces? Could we actually begin mobilizing on the spot? What were you prepared to do to save it, given everything you had just said? And as she also pointed out, this was not just a material issue, because she told the gathering that even if they failed and the bookstore closed, the idea of the bookstore, the idea that drove that bookstore needed to persist. And so how would it persist? How do you anticipate that the struggle must actually go on? So the third point, who are the working people? It's not just those working for a wage, which at any rate doesn't capture by half the context that exists in countries with high levels of informality, or where the informal and formal sector overlap or are simultaneous aspects of one's labor market experience. I'm at home in Guyana in my mom's house, the plumbing broke down. A Rasta brethren, Shafita Sedek, came yesterday. Turns out he's not just a plumber, he runs a swim club for young children in the community. And he also was president or co-president of the Guyana Crafts Association. So he's a craftsperson, and he's also in the Small Businessmen's Association. So people are doing multiple things simultaneously. In 1974, the WPA would actually define the working people in expansive terms that included the unemployed and housewives. In essay 6, they talk about this. By consistently reckoning with what that recognition could entail as a starting point is key. As we see in essay 13 on housewives that which you read for today, and which for me at least is actually one of the most important essays in this anthology, because it's a remarkable exercise in self-reflexivity in which Andai actually confronts the misrecognition of not seeing housewives as a sector of the working people. She actually wrote that essay for a special issue of a Caribbean journal, Macomera, that I was guest editing with Kate Quinn. But when it came time for the book, she had revised it completely based on the context in which she was writing and reflecting on all the stuff that she had actually missed. If we draw on Richard Iton's definition of politics in his book, In Search of the Black Fantastic, as, quote, a contest about what matters and ought to be subject to public consideration and debate, end quote, we might say that for Andai, and this is inextricably bound up with her involvement with the Wages for Housework and global women's strike campaigns, this contest was about foregrounding the epistemic importance of grassroots women's labor, largely unwaged, devalued, and invisible, as a central and constitutive part of the Caribbean radical tradition and as producer and reproducer of labor power. It involved disciplined attention to what Caribbean sociologist Cecilia Green describes as the nooks and crannies and living networks of the popular and domestic economy and its creative potential, end quote, and the potentially insurgent knowledge and lessons for self-organization that they contained. I'm almost done. Such disciplined attention also requires recognizing and reckoning with difference. In the context of multiracial Guyana, this would mean the question of race, African and Indian, often coastal, and at the expense of indigenous peoples who are 10% of our population. Of Walter Rodney's groundings with my brothers, Tony Bogues has written that, like many political ideas throughout the history of Black radical diasporic activity, as Black power traveled, it adapted to local conditions. For Walter, as a Pan-Africanist, the question was how to bridge the racial divide among the working peoples of the region, and specifically Guyana. And in fact, even before he returned, the Guyanese would turn out in their multiracial thousands to protest when he was denied employment at the University of Guyana, and to listen to the elder Ayusi Koyana, who is now 95 or 94 and lives in Atlanta, to listen to Ayusi read from Groundings, Walter's definition that Black in the Caribbean meant African and Indian. Andaya's multiracialism, and this is a portrait of her done by the African-American artist Tom Feelings in the 1970s. Andaya's multiracialism also comes out of an understanding of herself as African Guyanese, symbolized in her name change from Sandra Williams to Andaye, as a refusal of Eurocentric heteropatriarchal respectability, rejecting a surname, rejecting Williams, her father's name, a European name, rejecting the class politics in which people ask, who are you? What is your surname? As in, who are your people and who do you belong to? And are you somebody that should matter? In essay 6 on organizing within and against race divides, she reflects on some of the challenges of this work with a frank look at some of the blind spots of the time. Autonomous organizing, which is never the same as separation, would be one key takeaway from this analysis. And finally, and I was also asking simultaneously, how do we make our politics bigger? This was another slogan from the period of the WPA, the firmest unity is unity in struggle. And in the book, Andaye languages it in this way: working to build unity in struggle in the face of all that militates against it is a precondition of the continued work of enlarging our freedom. But the challenge, I think, is what is the basis for expanding, for making our politics bigger in the face of how difference is mobilized in such debilitating ways? And this is such a powerful quote from June Jordan's letter from the Bahamas. We can probably come back and talk about it in the discussion, but you know, where she says, jumping to the end, it occurs to me that much organizational grief could be avoided if people understood that partnership in misery does not necessarily provide for partnership for change. What happens beyond the idea of the enemy and the consequences of the enemy? I am saying the ultimate connection cannot be the enemy. The ultimate connection must be the need we find between us. It is not only who you are, in other words, but what we can do for each other that will determine the connection. And if the firmest unity is in unity and struggle, one of the humbling lessons that Andaye shares with us from that period of the 70s on page 63 is what happens when the struggle ebbs. Particularly, she says, if victories have not been won, the stage is set for that struggle to become weaker. And I think what we see instead in her example and in the work of Red Thread is a feminist approach to that slogan that really draws on June Jordan's understanding, where we're not thinking of struggle in spectacular ways, where solidarity is not assumed, but materializes in careful and ongoing practice and relation. And that little excerpt that the grassroots women put out of the Time Use survey that's in the reading kit as well, is an example, I think, of what it means to work carefully and slowly at the seam, to specify the connection across African, Indigenous, and Indian grassroots women. It was actually carried out by 4 grassroots Red Thread women, 2 Indian and 2 African, with 101 grassroots women across the country. And one of those women, Joy Marcus, who will be teaching a class at the University of the West Indies in a few weeks, describes it in this way, quote, "For us, the Time Use survey is the tool we need to build anti-racist organizing among grassroots women in Guyana. It led to a number of things. I'm not going to have time to go into that, but I can elaborate if we want. But I want to end with Andaye's words. This is one example of what time use leads to. This was during our massive floods in 2005. And I say that as, you know, the country is now in the midst in some parts of Guyana of some of the worst floods that we have seen in decades in indigenous communities and on rural communities on the coast of Guyana. But the time use survey became a central tool for organizing. And I'd like to end now with just 9 minutes of Andaye speaking, so you get a sense of how time use works. Okay, so let me find the clip. Oh dear. Okay. I'm sorry, I closed it, and so I have to just give me 1 second. You probably can hear the workers in the background as we. Just gonna pull it up.
Far back.
Okay. Just going to share my screen. Everyone can see the screen? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Global Women's Strike, in addition to this action that people take every year, has become increasingly a network of women in the 60 countries, which network functions throughout the year. So for example, we do work throughout the year in various parts of the world in support of Haiti, and we do work in various parts of the world in support of Venezuela. The theme that we have for the Global Women's Strike internationally is Invest in Caring, Not Killing, which is a call for the $1 trillion that is wasted on military to be redirected to meeting people's needs. And you know, when we first made that call, everybody said this was very fanciful, but recently it's coming out of quite normal people like the World Bank and so on, normal compared to us. The only country that we know of that recognizes what is at the heart of this call, which is a recognition of women's caring work, which is unwaged, the caring work that produces children and reproduces them every day. The only country that recognizes that and recognizes what that produces for the society is Venezuela, which does so in its constitution, where Article 88 says that the housework that women do, the caring work that women do without any wage, is work that produces welfare and wealth, thereby entitling housewives to social security. Dr. Bisnot, we would like that in the Constitution here, and Mr. Dev, and any other MPs in the room. Now, how does this connect with the event that we have today? If you go back to the title of the occasion that we have today, it is Counting Women's Work in Ensuring Guyana's Survival from the Flood. And what this event is for, therefore, is to count the work that women have done so far in ensuring Guyana's survival from the flood, and to begin to say what it is that grassroots women need if they are to be enabled to continue that work. What they need, not as a handout, but as an entitlement. Now, when we talk about the work that women did during the flood, this is not to say that we think men did no work. We saw men doing work. We saw men organizing in communities and so on. But to be fair, we also saw men doing other things. We saw them playing some dominoes, some cards, taking a drink and so on. And what was happening is what often happens in this society and in every other society. That the reason women behave in a different way is not because we're nice and men are not nice. It is because of the connection between women and their children. It is because of the overwhelming responsibility that women have for the care of their children, out of which women do whatever is required in order for their children to survive. So, for example, Chano was saying the other day that she waded through water every single time they had to go to the high road to get food, which usually was thrown at them, because she did not want her children to wade through the water and to get the illnesses that she herself knew she was going to get from walking there herself. And Minister Bibi Shadiq said the other day at a meeting organized by the Women's Forum, it is the women of Guyana who defended their children from disease and death. And we believe that that is true. So, near finally, how did we come to this point? We started, those of us who are in Red Thread, we started in communities distributing what is called relief. And in doing that, we were working very closely with the Alissa Foundation, which raised all of the money and all of the goods that we were distributing. As we were doing that, we began to recognize that people were beginning to organize, and that the women were often in the leadership of that organization. That the organizing sometimes was in response to being told by an NGO or by a government agency that they had to organize in order to get relief. But in some places it was also true that people went beyond that and began to be self-directed. And as we recognized that, we recognized as well that if people in Guyana are going to get what they need to recover and rebuild, if women in particular are going to get what we need to recover and rebuild, then building on that organizing that began in the relief phase must continue. You know, Guyana has signed every single international treaty dealing with the safety of the environment and with reducing poverty. But we believe that tackling both of those things requires that what are called ordinary people and ordinary women self-organize to find their own solutions. And while nobody can question that the flood was a huge tragedy for families in Guyana, the flood is also, in a sense, an opportunity that we seize or that we let go and fail again. And the opportunity is for us to return to being able to engage in a politics that is not only about our political parties, we're not leaving those. That is not only about our race, we're not leaving those. But that is also about us in the communities where we live, finding the ways to work out what is our vision, what it is we want, and how we are going to get it. And the reason why from the very beginning we organized both within individual communities and across communities is because we felt that the flood had not discriminated between Indo-Guyanese women and Afro-Guyanese women and indigenous women. And that the only way all of those women were going to get what they need and what they have in common as saying they need is if they find common ground and find a common way of organizing. So this public session today, before we break into working groups, is for women from different communities to speak out. What we did was that we listened to what people were saying in all the various meetings. We listened to what the women who were chosen to be in the panel were saying, and we noticed that it fell on the certain heads, and we are trying to stick to those heads as far as we can. The heads are who we are, who we care for, what we had to do, how hard we had to work to get what we have, how hard we had to work in order to survive the flood and to try to save what we had and to try to save the children. what we lost, and what we want. I want to apologize in advance for the fact that the platform has, and I just turned around so she could make me a liar. I was about to say the platform has no Indigenous women. Hello, Desiree. And it is because we did not work in St. Cuthbert's, which was one community that did flood. And we apologize just as sincerely for a big omission, which is that the platform has no women with disabilities. And the point that we are making is that while we all have in common as women, and particularly as grassroots women, an experience of the flood, but obviously where you were and who you were colors what that experience was. If you are a woman in a wheelchair, the experience of surviving the flood and of saving your children in the flood must be a different experience from if you are able-bodied. And so we will have presentations from the women up here. Then we will ask any women from the floor who wish to add to that. Then Chano and Nicola, who is not here, will tell you the draft demands we have so far. And then if there's anybody among the invitees that wishes to say anything, we would be happy to hear you. And finally, we have some ground rules. Ground rule number 1 is that this has been really an awful experience, and people feel extremely critical of different forces in the society. If they want to criticize, the ground rule is that they can criticize, but we will not be personal. Ground rule number 2 is that we will say what it is we need, but we will not beg. And ground rule number 3 is we will speak about race if race is relevant, but we will not be racist. Let's begin now. Karen?
Okay.
Wow,
That's it. Thank you.